All right, everyone, I'm excited to introduce my next guest, one of the co-authors of one of the greatest books ever to come out.
Thank you. I'll
Yes.
take that.
Super Visible, the story of the women of Marvel. This is a deep dive into the history of Marvel and the impact that women had on it throughout the years. So I'm excited to dive in with Judy Stephens, one of the co-authors, along with Jeanette Schaefer and Margaret Stoll. But Judy Stephens is the one that's here right now. We're diving deep. We're going to have a good time. Let's talk women and Marvel.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for having me. I mean, this has been a long labor of love, this book. We've been working on this for almost 5 years, and my time at Marvel and both Janine's and Margie's is even more extended of that. So I'm just happy to be able to put some of these women's names in lights finally.
Let's talk about your time at Marvel and what brought you to being a part of this amazing book. You're a podcaster as well, Women of Marvel podcast.
Yes. Now I predominantly do producing, so I'm behind the scenes, so not necessarily in front of the mic as much as I used to. Actually, my day job is podcast producing, but I co-created the Women of Marvel podcast all the way back in 2014 with Janine Schaefer, who is one of my co-authors, along with Adria Cohen and Sana Amanat, who is the co-creator of Kamala Khan, along with G. Willow Wilson. And I spent almost 15 years at Marvel. I started there when I was in college, all the way back in 2006. Before there were movies and Marvel Studios, that was my time. Very small company back then, very family orientated in that idea. I mean, I think there was maybe 150 of us max in the office. It was kind of crazy. And I started going to conventions, and I came actually sort of into Marvel sort of sideways through cosplay and fandom. I had been going to conventions through anime many years before I started at Marvel, and then started going to conventions. But I recognized I was one of the few women that were in the Marvel booth, that were, hanging out. And there wasn't to say that they didn't exist. Like, the story of like any field is that women have always been there. They just, along the way, their names have gotten lost in the sands of time. And so the four of us came together. Really, it started on the Women of Marvel panel, was initially introduced in 2008, which is sort of like, I think, the moment in time where this book sort of birthed, but it took a long time to get there. And it was just a panel to talk about the different women who worked at Marvel, from the editors to the comic artists to the writers to different people behind the scenes. And so in 2014, we realized that we were really enjoying the conversations that were happening in this space at San Diego Comic-Con and New York Comic-Con and C2E2 and other conventions along the way, but we wanted to continue it year long. And so we came together and launched the podcast in May. Over the years, we did over 300 something episodes. Kind of insane how many episodes we did. I learned how to edit audio for this podcast, which is kind of crazy. I didn't know how to edit audio at the time. In 2020, Margaret came on, and we started working on this book. Janine and Margie are not able to be here today, but they're incredible, my incredible co-authors. I wouldn't be here without them. Margaret Stoll is obviously very well known for writing Beautiful Creatures. And she also wrote the prose Black Widow novels for Marvel, which is sort of how she came into the Marvel world. And then Janine has an incredible storied career as an editor within comics. She worked at DC and then Marvel and at Boom. And so she obviously knows. So each of us sort of have our own little box, so we understand where the world is, and we are able to bring those perspectives to the book.
The book is great, and it's just interview after interview. And you guys talked to like over 120 some folks, like,
yes,
from all decades. Like, how far were you able to go back?
We were able to talk to women who worked in the office in the 60s, in the late 60s, early 70s, and obviously more modern creators. And we really, when we first started to write the book, it was really like an opportune moment, not an opportune moment for society. It was, I came on board really in early 2021. We were stuck in our homes. We had sort of been stuck in our homes for almost a year at that point. So a lot of people were willing to just get on a Zoom call and talk to us for hours. Like, some calls, we talked to Kelly Thompson, who is a writer at Marvel and within comic space. We talked to her for like 3.5 hours. We had to take like a bathroom break halfway through our call with her because we know these people and they are incredible people and they have great stories, but also like it was about making sure that we got their story right along the way. But yeah, there was a point where like I kept on being introduced to more and more women within the space who specifically worked in the 80s and the 90s. And I had to be like, okay, maybe I should stop interviewing people because we have too much content, which is never a bad thing. This is and we say this in the book, this is just the beginning of the story of of the women that have worked at Marvel Comics. Like there are many, many more stories that we, didn't get a chance to hear. Obviously, some people have passed over the years, but we did get to talk to a lot of incredible people, including like Carol Suling and like some of these iconic women who wrote comics in the 1970s and are thankfully still alive today.
Wow. So what was some of the things that you heard that one kind of you're like the rumors were true. And then that's one category. And then another category would be like, oh my God, completely, I don't want to say blindsided you, but like you just didn't expect that you were about to uncover this type of stuff.
I mean, I will say, like, the reason why I worked at Marvel for so long was sort of this family idea of like this community that was built within the four walls. And that goes back all the way to, the era of Stan Lee in the 1960s, 1970s. It truly was a family experience. Most of the people that ended up getting a chance to work within the buildings, because back then comics weren't what they are today. They weren't these exciting things to do. They were just one other piece of publication and at the time, especially in the 1950s, comics were for everyone. There were hundreds of comics being printed all the time. It was truly, if you look into like the history of comics and like dive into like what really happened and evolved them, which obviously was the sort of like backlash against horror and violence on covers and like what are our children reading sort of type of thing sort of evolved that. So comics weren't necessarily like a thing you wanted to work at. They had kind of a bad rap. Oh, maybe not a bad rap, but they had a unique rap. So a lot of them were just like girlfriends. A lot of the women were just girlfriends or friends. That doesn't mean that they weren't fans themselves of comics. They probably came into the realm of these old comic legends because they liked comics and they would go to comic book conventions. I mentioned Carol Suling. Her and her ex-husband helped organize like the first New York comic convention in the late 1960s. They had gone to Worldcon, which still exists today, fell in love with this experience of this convention and this community, and like found an old hotel and brought together some of these iconic names of comic people like that you wouldn't even believe like were like, could be in the same room and signing comics, and you could buy comics for like $5. Like they brought them together into these incredible conventions. And so she was a fan herself before, and then got asked if she wanted to write, I'm blanking on the name, but anyways, got to write one of the comics in the 1970s. And like, she was like glad to do it, was able to tell that story. I mean, that was one of those, I love conventions. So those are the stories that I really love. The thing that sort of was the continuous story was that, especially in the 1970s, 1980s, it wasn't a boys club yet. Like there was obviously a lot of boys, but there were a lot of women, and having other women in the space, like especially in the 1980s, like Louise Simonson, who goes by Wheezy. She obviously wrote iconic and helped co-produce and edit iconic X-Men comics. The X-Men that we know today really come from the era of Wheezy. So it's like being able to like talk to her and just being like, she was like, oh, I don't know, we just worked together. It was great. It was a community. We supported each other. We helped each other. We did our time, and then we went on to do something different. And like that was really an interesting story. So there weren't any skeletons. I would say there's probably like we're not here to tell the skeletons. We're here to tell the stories of like these incredible women that were there. So every time anyone told me a unique story of just like fun moments in and it sounded like working in like in Marvel in the 1980s, early 1990s, like with the bullpen and stuff like that was just fun. It just sounded like fun.
Part of the book talked about, I love Comic Cons as well. I love to hear like how hardcore cosplayer you are, because it's funny, like when you go, there's like, I was taking a friend and I was like, there's levels of cosplay. Those people over there, they're just holding a lightsaber. That's like barely trying.
Cosplayers, but yes, there are levels of cosplay.
Yeah. And then you got the ones that like they walk up to you and they got these contacts in their eyes and they change their eyes to like fire red or something. It's like, and like this elaborate costume and all that. In the book, it talked about X-Men, the animated series. Comic-Con I was just at had 8 of the original folks. As a matter of fact, right there, that's Storm. She was cool. She was really, and so she's saying, but it was such a cool thing. Like they had like all the Jean Grey and Wolverine and Beast and like all of the core X-Men there. It was like, but in the book, it was interesting that you guys kind of touched on that and think of that. And then now with X-Men 97, it's back.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm so happy that those voice actors are having their moment. When we would do the podcast, we'd always ask, how did you get started in comics? And obviously, like, I don't know if necessarily need to ask that question to women anymore. I think it's a general question, but a lot of times it was the story specifically of the X-Men animated series. For me, that was how I got knowledgeable about comics, because it was on after another show that I was watching. And I was like, oh, this was cool, because like, especially in the early 1990s, was anyone going to give a girl a comic? I was never going to be given a comic unless it was like My Little Pony or Barbie. Although Marvel did work with Mattel in the 1990s to print Barbie comics, and they were some of the first work for women creators were given the work for Barbie. But like, so the X-Men animated series was sort of like that thing. And so when we were starting to work on this book, we got put in contact with Julia Lewald, who is one of the writers on the series, and they brought her back to help with the new series. And she, along with her husband, put together a book, I think probably like 5 or 6 years ago, that like showcases the art and the story of like how it came to be. And then from there, she put us in touch with Margaret Loesch, who was the woman who helped Fox Kids become what it is today. Truly reevaluate, like truly like refresh the way that Saturday morning cartoons exist for kids. A lot of the way that we watch cartoons now are really thanks to what they did at Fox Kids. And she had worked when Stan Lee had built his production company in the 1980s. She had worked with Stan. And so then but they couldn't sell they couldn't sell an X-Men thing. They really struggled to sell anything with X-Men. And so once she was in charge with Fox Kids, she came back to Stan and was like, we got to do this. So we have a little pull-out chapter of hers. One of the things we really focus on in this book is the women's words, right? Is who we talk to in their words. So there's so many quotes. There's so many moments where we just took like whole parts of the conversation and sort of like collected them into little like reads, and like that having Margaret on the phone, honestly, truthfully, was like one of our like, oh my God, I can't believe we did that.
That's awesome. So that's Super Visible, the story of the women of Marvel. That's the name of the book. We talked about it a little bit for a second before we started taping, but talking about like the origin of the name of the book, where that came from.
Yeah. So when we weren't sure what we wanted to call it. Obviously, we knew that we had the Women of Marvel in there, and we were just pitching ideas around. And I think it was actually on a call with Kelly Thompson, where she just went, because we were talking about, well, the way that we would always phrase the conversation was about sort of introducing how we wanted this book to feel, was the first female superhero that is created and built into the Marvel universe, not who existed previous to sort of the 1960s Marvel, was a woman whose powers made her invisible. And does that say so much about women in society in the 1960s and even the struggle that we are running today? I think Kelly was like, why don't you call it like super visible? Like, it's this idea of like taking this idea of the invisible woman, who is a strong woman in her own right. She obviously, like, she is a fierce to be reckoned in the comics. Like, her storyline is very changed now. But in that moment of time, when you just look at this character and its powers, you sort of think about like, what does that mean and what does that say? And it took a long time also for like a female character to be able to have powers that really mattered and made a difference. And she wasn't like overloaded by her powers, like when you look at like Jean Grey and like all these different things. But yeah, so like the title Super Visible was just like, oh, that's perfect. That works exactly. And all we had to do was get sign off from everyone up the chain. Thankfully, everyone signed off on it.
Now, Judy, not to blow your mind or anything, but I don't know how, being from Marvel, you feel about the Roger Corman Fantastic Four movie, but one of my obsessions is that movie, and it came from Comic-Con. I have the VHS. And at one point, I made it my obsession to get as many people from that movie on my podcast, one of which was Rebecca Staub, who was the technically first live action Sue Storm.
I've never seen it, but I've obviously seen stills from that. And like we used to talk about that all the time in the office of like, especially as the movies really started to explode. And we were like, we have to like do a screening of this movie because just like when he like extends his arms, it's so funny.
It's obviously doesn't compare visually to that, but it's a fun watch. It's a fun watch. But I was just like, oh, the first and now Sue Storm's having her moment again,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, the movie looks incredible. I mean, I'll follow Pedro, whatever he does, but yeah, no, I'm excited for it when it comes out this summer.
And great timing for the book too, right? Because then
Yeah.
you can ride that.
Ride the wave.
Um,
Yeah.
all right, so we talk about Sue Storm being the first and invisible. So, like, when we talk about the evolution of the female superhero? I know that wasn't exactly what was covered in the book, but over time, like Margaret eventually wrote Black Widow and Carol Danvers, and it would have been of that time, and versus where they're basically wearing no clothes, and they eventually Carol Danvers has a full suit. I mean, like how women are thought of as superheroes changed over time as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like making comics for obviously like comics used to be made for everyone. There were a type of comic for everyone, and specifically comics made for girls were romance comics, were sort of this different era of comics. These sort of still exist. I mean, you can definitely look at Archie as like one of those options that still exists in that idea. Those obviously were, all the rage in the 40s and the 50s and then sort of faded off. And like every once in a while they bring them back, but they're not to what like the sheer volume of comics that were being made back then. But in the 1970s, obviously Fantastic Four was doing incredible. So was X-Men, looking at these Spider-Man. And so in 1972, as sort of second wave feminism was sort of exploding, and indie comics were really becoming this force over in San Francisco with some incredible art being done like that. Some queer comics, lesbian comics, all these different things. One of the women we specifically talked to for this book, who sadly passed last year, was Trina Robbins. And Trina was one of the like women just leading the charge in indie comics and just wanting to write comics and didn't care what comic was, but she just wanted to write it. And so she did a whole bunch of anthologies where she celebrated female creators. And so they existed. They're always over here. But so Stan Lee decided, and along with the Marvel editorial staff in the 1970s, that they were like, we should create three, or we should like have three characters that are for like female-led superheroes that are for women. And so they brought in, Carol Celine is one of the people they brought in. And so they created Night Nurse, Shauna the She-Devil, and Black Cat. And all three of these characters still exist today in different entities. The Black Cat is now like the cat, and like different, they've sort of evolved. They're not all of them are tied back to their original, like Shauna is tied back to her original identity, but like they've kind of evolved over the time. Night Nurse is obviously in Daredevil. And so each one of them were, written. And example for the cat, one of the first women that ever worked at Marvel outside of Flo Steinberg, who was Stan Lee's assistant. She was known as Fabulous Flo. She's pretty famous within the space of Marvel. She was actually working there up until she passed away as a copywriter, as a proofreader. And she was the sweetest little lady. She'd come up and give you like a wet kiss on your cheek whenever she saw you. It was very, very, it felt very special that I had opportunity to sort of know her before she passed. Marie Severin was the first sort of female creator brought on, and she drew the original version of the cat. All three of these women came on. Obviously, the books didn't sell great. It was a hard time for comics and for women in comics, and just a period of time. And so, they sort of faded and they ended the series. But over time, they, every few years, they'd bring a new person back. So like, for example, Miss Marvel, Carol Danvers, a couple years later, they created her. She was Miss Marvel at the time. She didn't become Captain Marvel until about a decade ago. And then in the 1980s, I think it was really this introduction of more female editors into the space that started to introduce more female characters. But I don't think we don't like the way that we think about, gender identity and equality was not a way that they lived necessarily. They were just sort of making content to make content. And they wanted to write characters that either look like them or just happened like, oh, this was a friend of mine. I needed to write a character and I put it in. When you ask them about it now, they kind of just go like, oh, whatever. But so then over time, obviously, X-Men really exploded. A lot more female characters were introduced into that period of time. And then the 90s was a hard time for, I think, women in comics. And then really, I think it was this evolution of the movies that's truly brought a fresh new audience to, and this is going all the way back to the first Spider-Man in I think it was like 2001 when the first Spider-Man came out. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, and then obviously the X-Men, and then obviously Marvel Studios then in 2008. Bringing new audiences that to it at that point gave Marvel DC all the comics to really evaluate like, oh, there's this new audience here. We can A, create new characters, bringing on also famous writers to come on and write books and just sort of evaluate. And I think that's where female characters have really become so much more real. They feel more like us now. I think, obviously going all the way to Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, and a Muslim superhero, I think is sort of the pivotal of like, we're doing it, we're figuring it out. There are comics for everyone now. But it was definitely a long road to go down, and we definitely have to thank all the women who helped along the way, and men. Obviously, there were lots of men doing things too.
Couple men. Couple men. The theme of this podcast episode is it wasn't just Stan Lee. What? Is it cool to be able to see these movies become so big, and like some of these characters that to see Carol Danvers become embodied by Brie Larson and like become like a real thing, and even Miss Marvel. It's got to be kind of cool to be able to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no longer at Marvel. I still freelance for them, but when I first got hired at Marvel, when I used to have to talk about working at Marvel, I'd have to say Marvel Comics, and then I'd have to say like Spider-Man, the Hulk. No one knew who Iron Man was at that time. And then the movies started coming out, and this sort of fandom that like we lived in a little bubble, and we like enjoyed our characters and we enjoyed reading, and like, okay, the movies came out, and then suddenly I would go to conventions and the Marvel cosplay meetups would grow. They'd become these, I mean, in 2015, I go to Dragon Con, which is this huge fandom convention down in Atlanta over a Labor Day weekend. And it's everything goes fandom. It's incredible. It's like 80,000 people in costume. And the Marvel meetup one year, we had over 800 people show up to this meetup in costume, which is like wrangling cosplays are already kind of hard to wrangle. And like, imagine wrangling 800. But it was just this incredible experience to watch as also Marvel grew as social media grew, right? Marvel was one of the first big brands on Twitter. One of my old coworkers at Marvel who's still there, Ryan Panagos, Agent M, he was, everyone knew who he was, and he really advocated for Marvel. And like, we would go to conventions and just experience this in a way that was like, you just couldn't put into words. That every convention we went to, it grew, and the booth got crazier, and the talent every year got more and more famous. And suddenly I was interacting with like these incredibly famous celebrities, and I was like, how did I end up here? I don't know. I just did web design. It was kind of a crazy ride for a really long time. But the best part was just seeing the fan interactions and seeing these fans connect to these characters in a way that was so unique, and also seeing the fandom get diverse, right? Like those first initial comic book conventions I went to was predominantly white men. And then now you go to a comic book convention and it's as incredibly diverse as possible. Like everyone can enjoy these comics and enjoy them in different ways. Because I think that's also what's really interesting is that now it's more than just obviously reading comics as the OG, it's the origin. But all these creators have built this sort of dynasty, these stories that now exists in mobile games, in console games. It exists in books. It exists in movies and TV shows. It's any way that you want to consume this content is readily available, and for all ages, which is kind of amazing.
That is amazing. You can see by all my 8x10s, I'm a big Comic-Con fan. That's where all my money goes. I love meeting the celebs, and then it's funny, like the Comic-Cons. I assume the other ones are like that too. It's like people signing autographs. Then you have the artists. There's a whole section of artists, and then people selling like toys. Or you're right. I find every section fascinating of all that. I love it. So when you cosplay, when you dress Marvel, which character are you going as?
I do Carol. I'm pretty known for my Captain Marvel. I've done almost every version of her outside of the movies. I haven't done all the movies versions. They're much harder. They're much harder than comic book versions. But yeah, I first cosplayed her in 2012 when she sort of came up as Captain Marvel instead of being Miss Marvel. I went because at the time when she first came out, she had my hair, and I walked into one of my coworkers' office, and he goes, "Oh, you have Carol's hair," and I was like, "What?" And I had seen the art, and they showed me Jamie McKelvey's art of Carol's new uniform, and I was like, "Oh, oh, I do. Okay, I think I'll make that this year." And so I made that in 2012, and then I'd never made a soda spandex bodysuit at that point. By the way, they're much harder than they look. But since then, I've done almost every version of her suit, including the newest one that Jen Bartel just did, which is beautiful and I love it. I'm making the jacket now with the embroidery, but that's what I typically do. But the other one I love to do is Mystique. You mentioned contacts at the beginning. I love to become blue, put yellow contacts in, and not become me anymore because she's not a villain, but she's not a good guy. She kind of lives in that sort of middle ground of like, what side is she on today? And I really like that as a character of like, she's not perfect and she doesn't want to be perfect. Unlike this sort of ideal that we put our superheroes on, our like, we put Captain America on, we put Carol on. Playing someone like Mystique is fun and interesting and different.
Those are two really good ones. Back to the book. We do some comic book swish, whoosh, something. All right, we talked about Flo and her powerhouse legacy. So, what other women in the book do you talk about? That a couple other ones that you would highlight as having the biggest impact that we're not aware of?
I would say the 1980s is I specifically mentioned Louise Simonson. She was one of just a few, like, there was a ton of female editors that worked at Marvel at the time. Annie Nocenti is still working within sort of the space. She edits here and there, she writes here and there, but she was the one who killed Elektra. So, obviously, she didn't really, there was a writer that wrote that, but she was the one who edited the book that killed Elektra and then realized that she didn't actually want to kill Elektra. But she talks about that. I've had a chance to talk to her in the past on the Woman Marvel podcast. She's great. And another woman in that time period was Jo Duffy, who worked on a lot of Iron Fist, Power Man and Iron Fist books. Pretty long run in those, really helped sort of make that book a successful book. And so there's a lot of women, like specifically in the 1980s, behind the scenes, going into sort of this era. Obviously, we know Kelly Sue DeConnick, incredible. I mean, talking about Captain Marvel and Carol Danvers and what she has done and continues to do for women in comics is pretty incredible. She does a thing. I'm not sure what platform she does it now on, but she used to do it on Twitter, which was once a year. She would all week. If you tagged her, she would retweet that you were a woman who worked in comics. And here's what I'm writing. Here's what I'm working on. Just to sort of be like, put a spotlight on this. Like, these people still exist, and she's still doing that even now. One of the chapters that we specifically tied into was this era for the X-Men comics when Hickman came back and he wanted to bring in a much more diverse writing room. And he wanted to create it much more as a writing room, right? There were writers on each book that he wanted it to feel maybe a little bit more like a TV show, like where there's a writing room. And he brought in these 3 specific comic writers who at the time sort of knew of each other, but hadn't really had a chance to specifically meet each other until they worked on this book. And it's one of the non-binary writers we have on, which is Vita Ayala. Vita came on, and then Leah Williams and Teenie Howard. I'm not sure if Leah is still not writing for Marvel right now, but Teenie is currently working on some books on DC. The 3 of them have never really had an opportunity to meet, and then they met right before the pandemic. One of the photos I took in the book where they all like met in person for the first time was at C2E2 2020, which was the last weekend in February. What a time that was back then. But they became really good friends, and they would just get on calls and just like write, just sitting on calls, write each other during the pandemic to keep them on. And they wrote these like powerhouse books for a couple years at Marvel as part of under the Jonathan Hickman era. But there's so many more. I mean, Kelly Thompson is an incredible writer at Marvel. I mean, there's so many names. I mean, I had to like go back through my list before this call. I was like, oh my God, I have to remember every woman's names. But there's so many people that we got to talk to that either were like writing, working on the comics, bullpen, or the stories of women that were there and then sadly passed before we talked to them. Marie Severin is one of those names. There was a woman who worked in Marvel in the late 80s, early 90s, and she really was an advocate for the comic store and really helped sort of advocate for that space and help comic stores become sort of what you're known for today. Her name was Carol Kalish. She sadly passed away on her way to work one day, going to New York City. And so those are the stories of like, we talked to other people that knew them and that they could tell me their story. So, but yeah, I just advocate, like, go buy the book. There are so many women's names. We have like a glossary at the front where we give everyone like what they worked on and their date. So like we understand there's a lot of names in the book, but we're really happy about it too.
No, I mean it's very Gail Simone.
See, there's so many women's names. I'm like going through my brain. I'm like, what?
Yeah, well, I'm just impressed that I could come up with a name that you didn't mention. You named so many. I know her from obviously she's prolific with the comics, but I followed her on Twitter. She was quite a powerhouse on Twitter back.
She's definitely posting on Facebook a lot, and I think she's on one of the other platforms too. I highly recommend following Gail. She tells you all the gossip of what's happening in comics.
Okay, so we know what inspired you to create the book. Sort of the goal also to inspire kind of the next generations.
For me, it was really important that I had, growing up, my mother worked in STEM. I mean, she still technically works in STEM. And she was a woman working in computer science before the idea that it was like, we need to get more women in this space and all this stuff. My mom just worked there and she was the only one of the few women in the office and she knew how to code and she knew how to code better than the boys. And so I grew up with a woman that could do something that wasn't expected of her. And so it just was seamless for me to decide to move to New York City and just do what I wanted to do. I never second guessed who I was and what I wanted to do. I mean, obviously we all have sort of imposter syndrome. There have definitely been moments along the way where I'm like, But when we started working on the podcast and the panel, the number one experience that we got that would really sort of just be the cement that was like, this is why we're doing it, I'm not moving, was the moms who would come up and say, thank you so much. My daughter can see that there is an opportunity for her in this space. She loves this. She doesn't know what she wants to do yet, but she knows that she can do something. And so I really always tried to have the panel, obviously the most public facing thing we did, be a diverse group of women and sometimes non-binary people that would come up that did different things, right? They weren't just writers. They weren't just artists. They weren't just editors. They were all different ways. And that was something that was really important to me in this book too, was that I want anyone who's going to read this book be like, hey, I can't write and I can't draw. Oh, but I can project manage. They may not know that term, but I know how to, I can keep myself on time with putting my homework in. That means I can also work in comics. I can also work at Marvel. I mean, and even now you can also work on the movies, right? Like the movies are all about project management. And so that's really important. And I think it's the number one thing was for me was I wanted to make sure that these women had their chance to have their name in lights. We all know the story of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. But do we know the story of Marie Severin or Louise Simonson or some of the women that are coming up today writing? Not yet. And so this is just part one. And so hopefully this sort of advocates for more people to learn about these creators and there be a sort of, and now it's going to go into the Library of Congress. It is a part of history. These people's stories are now written in stone and they'll exist for the next generations to read and learn about.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Judy. It's awesome. And to Jeanette and Margaret, your co-authors.
I know. I definitely go. We're going to be doing tons of stuff. If you are in the New York City area, we have a event that we're doing at Powerhouse Books in Dumbo in Brooklyn on June 23rd. Follow me on social media. We're going to be posting about it. Margaret also is going to be doing a couple events across the country, all up that week of book release. Our book comes out June 24th. We would love if you pre-ordered. You can pre-order wherever you get your books. Obviously, support your local bookstores if you can, your indie bookstores, but obviously it's available on the big boys too, on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all that type of stuff. But yeah, hopefully we'll be at San Diego Comic-Con this year. We might do something at New York Comic-Con. So stay tuned.
Awesome. The book is Super Visible, the story of the women of Marvel. You can also check out Judy's podcast, Women of Marvel, as well. So much Women of Marvel. You spend hours and hours and hours.
Yeah.
Judy, thank you so much for hanging out with me and sharing all these stories. I'm excited for the book to come out.
Thanks so much, Jeff.